I want you to picture something in your mind right now. Just imagine a stark, completely white page.
Like totally blank.
Yeah, totally blank. And on the far left side of this page, I want you to mentally write down a year, which is 1990.
Okay, and 290. Got it.
And right below that year, write down a number, $9.
9. It's just $9.
$9 because that was the approximate GDP per capita in this country back in 1990.
Which is just, I mean, that is extreme poverty.
Exactly. Now, let your eyes drift all the way over to the far right side of that white page and write down the year 2023.
Right.
And below that, write down new number, $4,717.
That's a huge jump.
Right. Finally, right in the center of that page, just connecting those two numbers, I want you to draw a massive upward pointing red arrow.
I think I see where this is going.
And right in the middle of that arrow, write this label, plus 4,700%.
It's a trajectory that almost breaks your brain when you really study the mechanics behind it.
It really does. You simply do not see that kind of compounding economic acceleration in modern global economics without, discovering an ocean of oil under the sand or something.
Right, like hitting the resource lottery.
Exactly. It defies almost every historical precedent we have for a country of that demographic size and geographic complexity.
So the big question for you listening is, how did they pull off a 4,700% miracle when so many other middle-income countries just hit a wall and stagnated?
Yeah, the classic middle-income trap.
Exactly. Well, we've got the Vietnam National Development Research Report covering 1990 to 2023, plus this massive mountain of World Bank data to find out.
And, if you're listening to this and assuming this is just the standard playbook.
Like the usual sweatshop narrative.
Yeah, exactly. A developing nation throwing millions of underpaid workers into factories to make cheap plastic goods. We really need to dismantle that assumption right now.
Because it's way more complex than that, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because, cheap labor is incredibly common. Dozens of nations have an abundance of inexpensive young labor, yet they remain trapped in systemic poverty.
Right. Cheap labor alone doesn't equal a miracle.
Not at all. Growth miracles of this magnitude are exceptionally rare. The true drivers of Vietnam's rise are, it's a preemptive, highly calculated layout of human capital.
Human capital.
Yeah, and a deep systemic coupling with global trade structures. They didn't just offer cheap hands, they engineered an entire society to integrate seamlessly into the modern global supply chain.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really grasp how you engineer society on that scale, we have to start with the macro view.
The big picture.
Right. The sources refer to the last 3 decades as Vietnam's golden era, and the data categorizes this national rebirth into 4 specific quadrants.
4 pillars, basically.
Yeah. First, you have the economy quadrant, where they managed to maintain an astonishing 5% to 9% annual GDP growth rate over decades.
Which is wild to sustain for that long.
It really is. Second, the transformation quadrant. They fundamentally shifted from an agrarian society where almost everyone farmed to survive.
Right, mostly rice paddies and agriculture.
Exactly. To one where industrial value added now accounts for over 37% of their entire GDP.
And those first 2 quadrants alone would be an impressive achievement. But they are intrinsically linked to the 3rd and 4th quadrants.
Which are livelihood and wealth distribution.
Yeah. The World Bank data shows unprecedented drops in extreme poverty paired with a consistently rising gross national income. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, growth is rarely, if ever, this perfectly symmetrical.
Wait, symmetrical in what sense? Do you mean like geographically or across different social classes?
I mean symmetrical across the entire economic ecosystem. In developmental economics, you usually see a country nail 1 or maybe 2 of these quadrants, but pay a terrible price in the others.
Oh, I see. Like they get rich but stay unequal.
Exactly. Take resource-rich nations, for example. A country might discover massive copper or oil reserves. Their GDP skyrockets, nailing the first quadrant.
But the people don't see the money.
Right. They completely fail at poverty reduction because all the wealth generated by extracting those resources is concentrated among a few political elites and foreign mining corporations.
The classic resource curse.
Yep. Or, alternatively, a country might improve basic livelihoods and agricultural output, but completely fail to achieve the structural transformation from farms to factories.
Leaving them vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable.
Yeah.
To a bad monsoon season or a drop in global coffee prices, for instance.
So what makes the Vietnam data so special?
What is so remarkable here is that they managed a synchronized leap. They grew the economic pie, they changed the fundamental ingredients of what that pie was made of, and they ensured the slices were distributed in a way that lifted the vast majority of their population out of destitution.
Man, it sounds like upgrading a computer's fundamental operating system while the programs are actively running.
That's a great way to put it.
How do you completely rewire a society's central processor, literally moving millions of people from rice paddies to manufacturing assembly lines, without the whole social and economic system just freezing up and crashing?
You do it through an incredible, sustained balancing act. It takes domestic policy, strategic foreign investment, and honestly, brutal pragmatism.
Because the friction of that kind of change has to be huge.
Oh, the friction is immense. When a society undergoes a transition this rapid, you face massive inflation risks as new money floods the system.
Right.
You get infrastructure bottlenecks where ports and roads simply cannot handle the volume of goods. And you risk severe social unrest from rapid, unplanned urbanization.
But they managed to avoid that collapse.
They did. The government managed to grease the wheels of this transition, largely through the framework of the Doi Moi reforms initiated in the late 1980s.
And that was their big pivot, right?
Yeah, that officially transitioned them from a rigid, centrally planned system to what they call a socialist-oriented market economy. They learned to steer the market rather than trying to dictate every single transaction.
To really understand how effective that steering was, we have to look at the raw scale of the expansion. I was looking at the gross domestic product numbers in the World Bank data set, and the absolute size of the currency flow is staggering.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
Listen to this. In 2023, Vietnam's total GDP in current local currency, the Vietnamese dong, broke the 1.02 quadrillion mark.
A quadrillion. That is a number with 15 zeros.
It's a scale of currency that is genuinely hard to conceptualize, but, beyond the sheer volume of zeros, what really stands out in the data is the sheer resilience of that growth curve.
That's the key right there.
Right. Even when you factor in massive global economic shocks that cratered other economies, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global financial crisis, the severe supply chain disruptions of the recent global pandemic.
All massive hits to the global system.
Yeah, but their annual growth rate repeatedly rebounded, often touching that 9% high water mark.
And if you are wondering what a 9% growth rate actually feels like on the ground, remember the rule of 72 in finance.
Oh, right, where you divide 72 by the growth rate.
Exactly. You divide 72 by your annual growth rate to find out how many years it takes for your baseline to double. So if an economy grows at 9% a year, the entire economic output of that nation doubles in size every 8 years.
Every 8 years. That's insane.
Just imagine the roads, the buildings, the wages, the sheer volume of commerce in your country doubling and then doubling again and then doubling again within a single generation. It radically alters the physical reality of a country.
And if you track that economic growth against a timeline from 1990 to 2023, the real acceleration, the moment the rocket boosters truly ignite, happens right around the year 2005.
Yes, 2005 is huge in the data.
The growth rate spikes and sustains itself in a completely new tier. But wait, the mid-2000s were leading right into one of the most chaotic global economic periods in modern history.
That's exactly why 2005 is the critical inflection point. Economists refer to this as the beginning of Vietnam's deep integration period of global trade.
So they were gearing up for something big.
They were. This was the intense preparatory phase leading up to their official accession to the World Trade Organization in 2007.
Okay, so they were getting ready to join the WTO.
Exactly. And they didn't just casually open their borders to a few foreign companies. They systematically dismantled hundreds of trade barriers, overhauled their legal frameworks to align with international commercial law.
Wow, a total overhaul.
Yeah, and aggressively invited the global supply chain into their domestic economy.
But again, right after they joined the WTO in 2007, the 2008 global financial crisis hit. Global demand for manufactured goods plummeted as consumers in the US and Europe just stopped buying.
A total demand collapse.
Right. So wouldn't throwing your doors open right before a global crash be disastrous?
In theory, yes. Many export-heavy developing nations were absolutely decimated in 2008 and 2009.
Like factories closing everywhere.
Factories shuttered, millions were thrown out of work, and governments defaulted on debt. And Vietnam took a significant hit, certainly. Their export growth slowed.
But they didn't collapse.
No. What the sources highlight is that their overall GDP growth remained positive and rebounded remarkably fast. Their domestic policy framework was robust enough to absorb the shock.
How did they do that, practically speaking?
Well, they used targeted domestic stimulus, heavily supported their agricultural sector as a social safety net, so unemployed factory workers had villages to return to temporarily.
Oh, that's smart, like a built-in backup plan.
Exactly. And they aggressively courted foreign direct investment from multinational corporations who were desperately looking to diversify their supply chains away from other, more expensive Asian manufacturing hubs.
So they used the global crisis to actually capture more market share.
They turned a crisis into a massive opportunity.
But a quadrillion local currency isn't just punted into existence by a central bank stimulus package. It has to be physically manifested. You have to physically build the value.
You need stuff, real physical stuff.
Which naturally brings us to the physical transformation of the country's landscape. The data shows a massive, deliberate shift away from land dependence.
The depth of their industrialization is the tangible, concrete manifestation of that 1.02 quadrillion dong.
The structural shift in the data is profound. If you look at the composition of their economy, agriculture goes from taking up vast amounts of the economic pie in the 1990s to being squeezed into a much smaller, albeit more efficient, corner.
A shrinking slice of the pie.
Yeah. Meanwhile, industry, and this includes massive infrastructure construction, went from making up roughly 22% of the GDP to over 37% recently.
That is a massive reallocation of labor.
But the metric that really highlights this transition is the manufacturing value added. In 1990, the total value added by manufacturing was about $5.5 billion. By 2023, that number had skyrocketed to nearly $105 billion.
To understand why manufacturing is the absolute core engine of a growth miracle, you have to look at the mechanics of productivity.
Break that down for us.
Well, agriculture has a strict, natural ceiling on productivity. There is only so much rice a single farmer can pull from a single hectare of land, even if you give them the best fertilizer and modern tractors. The land itself is the limiting factor.
Right. You can't magically make an acre of land twice as big.
Exactly. But in manufacturing, the productivity ceiling is exponentially higher. When you take a worker whose economic output was previously capped by the yield of a small rice paddy, and you train them to operate machinery on a semiconductor assembly line,
Their output just skyrockets.
their economic output multiplies overnight. The machine, the technology, and the global demand allow that single human hour of labor to generate vastly more financial value.
So manufacturing doesn't just grow the industrial sector. It effectively pulls the entire rest of the economy upward with its gravity.
Precisely. A $105 billion manufacturing sector requires an immense supporting ecosystem. You can't run modern factories on a fragile power grid, so massive investments in energy infrastructure are triggered.
You need ports, roads.
Deep-water ports to ship the goods, multi-lane highways to move the containers, complex logistics networks, and eventually high-end financial, insurance, and legal services to manage the corporate contracts.
The factory is the engine, but it forces the entire vehicle to be upgraded.
That's a perfect analogy.
I track the logic there, but it raises a massive logistical question for me. It's one thing to build the factories and move the workers off the farms, but who are they selling all these manufactured goods to?
The demand side of the equation.
Right. Because a domestic market in a newly developing country, where people are just starting to earn a steady wage, simply cannot absorb a leap from $5.5 billion to $105 billion in complex manufactured goods that fast. I mean, they aren't buying $100 billion worth of smartphones and athletic shoes themselves.
They aren't, and this is the absolute anchor of the entire Vietnam strategy. Hyper-aggressive foreign trade.
Selling to the rest of the world.
They recognized early on that their domestic consumer base was too poor and too small to drive the scale of industrialization they wanted. So they didn't build an industrial base to serve themselves. They built it to serve the world.
And the statistics on this are almost unbelievable. According to the World Bank data, trade in goods as a percentage of Vietnam's GDP went from under 20% in 1990 to peaking at over 100% in recent years.
It's an astronomical leap.
The sheer volume of their trade leapt so incredibly fast relative to the size of their own economy. And the structure of what was inside those shipping containers completely transformed, moving away from raw agricultural commodities and raw minerals, with complex manufactured goods completely dominating their exports.
What's fascinating here is Vietnam didn't just participate in globalization on the margins. They threw themselves into the absolute center of the vortex.
They went all in.
They really did. They engineered their economy to become one of the most highly globalized emerging markets on the entire planet. They made themselves an indispensable node in the global supply chain.
Wait, I need to pause on that statistic because it sounds mathematically impossible. How can a country's trade exceed its entire GDP? How can trade be over 100% of gross domestic product?
It's a common point of confusion, and it comes down to how macroeconomics measures different activities. GDP measures the total value added within a country's borders during a specific time. Trade volume, however, measures the total gross value of everything coming in and everything going out.
Okay, can you give me a specific example?
Let's use a smartphone. Imagine a factory in Vietnam assembling a high-end smartphone. They import the OLED screen from South Korea for $40. They import the camera sensors from Japan for $10. So they have $50 in imports.
Got it. $50 worth of parts.
Then, Vietnamese workers assemble those components, test the software, and package it, adding $10 of value through their labor and factory overhead. The GDP created in Vietnam is only that $10 of value added.
Okay, that makes sense. The $10 is their GDP contribution.
But then, they export that finished, fully assembled phone to the United States for $60. The total trade volume recorded for that single phone is the $50 import of parts, plus the $60 export of the finished product.
Oh, so that equals $110 of total trade.
Exactly.
Right.
$110 in trade. But the GDP the actual value created inside Vietnam was only $10.
Ah, so when trade vastly exceeds GDP, it means the country is acting as a massive, high-volume global processing hub.
Exactly. They are importing raw materials, microchips, textiles, and intermediate components on a colossal scale, adding immense value through their highly efficient manufacturing base and immediately exporting the finished high-value products to consumer markets in the U.S., Europe, and developed Asia.
It's a high-volume, high-efficiency machine designed specifically for global arbitrage.
And it works brilliantly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Building factories, paving roads, opening deep-water ports, that is all relatively straightforward on paper. It's just capital allocation and pouring concrete.
Right, the hardware.
But you can't run a $105 billion globally integrated manufacturing sector with empty buildings. You need an army of capable, trained, highly disciplined people to operate complex machinery, manage those intricate supply chains, and maintain strict quality control standards for foreign buyers.
And this is the exact precipice where most developing nations fail.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. They court the foreign direct investment, they build the special economic zones, they pour the concrete for the factories, but they fundamentally neglect to build the workforce required to run them. Vietnam did not make that mistake.
The data reveals this as the true underlying power of their economic miracle. The Human Capital Index, the HCI.
A crucial metric.
According to the World Bank data we are analyzing, Vietnam scores between 0.67 and 0.69 on this index.
To give you some global context, that is an incredibly high score for a lower middle-income country. It rivals, and in some metrics exceeds, the human capital scores of many advanced, fully developed economies.
Let's define what that 0.67 number actually means in the real world for you listening. The Human Capital Index calculates that a child born in Vietnam today can expect to be at least 67% as productive in their adult working life as they hypothetically would be if they enjoyed perfect, world-class education and full health from birth to adulthood.
It is fundamentally a measurement of future economic potential. The index tracks child survival rates, expected years of schooling, harmonized test scores, and stunting rates in children under 5.
It combines all of that.
It combines all these physiological and educational metrics to predict the future economic horsepower of a nation's population.
And when you dig into the cross-sections of that data, there is a brilliant, crucial anomaly. The female human capital index is 0.72.
Yes.
It significantly outperforms the male human capital index, which sits at 0.65. This isn't just a minor statistical variation, it's a massive structural gap.
And I would argue it is perhaps the single most important data point in this entire research report.
The single most important.
Elevating the quality, education, and health of female labor is the absolute crux of this growth miracle. In many developing economies, deep-seated cultural norms or institutional barriers keep women primarily engaged in unpaid domestic labor, child rearing, or invisible subsistence agriculture.
Basically kept out of the official numbers.
Right. And when that happens, half of a nation's entire economic potential is effectively sidelined from the formal economy.
It's like trying to win a Formula One race with half of your engine's spark plugs intentionally disconnected.
That's a perfect way to look at it. By investing heavily in the health and education of girls early on, and then structurally bringing those highly capable literate women into the formal manufacturing and services sectors, Vietnam essentially doubled its economic horsepower overnight.
Doubled it. Wow.
If you look at the workforce composition in the massive garment factories, the electronics assembly lines producing global smartphones, and the burgeoning tech and services sector, they are fundamentally powered by this highly literate, highly capable female workforce.
You simply do not generate a 1.02 quadrillion dong economy without women driving a massive formalized portion of that output.
Exactly. You just don't.
But an HCI score of 0.69 doesn't happen by accident. You can't just pass a law and suddenly wish a highly educated, healthy workforce into existence the day a foreign tech company decides to open a factory.
No, it takes generations.
To get an index score that high, you have to pour the concrete for that human foundation decades in advance.
Which points directly to their education evolution. This is where we see the extraordinary foresight of Vietnamese policymaking, particularly during the early days of the Doi Moi reforms when the country was still desperately poor.
The numbers on their educational infrastructure are wild.
Huh.
The World Bank data shows that primary school completion has long been maintained at near 100%.
Just phenomenal coverage.
Basically, every single child in the country finishes primary school. Simultaneously, higher education enrollment has seen continuous, aggressive expansion. I like to think of their education strategy as a massive funnel.
Walk us through how that funnel operates in practice.
Imagine this funnel. At the very top, you have primary school enrollment. Vietnam made a conscious decision to make the top of that funnel as wide as physically possible, capturing almost 100% of the youth population, regardless of how remote their village was.
Right, getting everyone in the door.
Then, those literate students flow down into secondary education, and eventually, the bottom of the funnel flows into universities, technical colleges, and vocational training. By widening the very top of that funnel decades ago, they guaranteed that the bottom of the funnel would eventually pour out a massive continuous talent reserve capable of handling the complex, high-end industrial jobs of today.
What is vital to understand here is the agonizing timeline of that investment. You don't achieve a 100% primary completion rate overnight.
It takes years of sustained effort.
This was a deliberate, fiercely prioritized policy choice made back in the 1990s. At that time, the national budget was incredibly constrained. They were still dealing with the economic hangover of post-war isolation and the inefficiencies of central planning.
Money was incredibly tight.
Extremely. They had massive competing interests for every single dollar. They needed bridges, they needed military funding, they needed hospitals, yet they chose to prioritize the minds of the next generation.
Even over physical infrastructure.
Often relying on decentralized, village-level community funding to build basic schoolhouses and pay teachers, ensuring literacy was treated as a matter of national survival. They prioritized reading and math before the modern factories were even blueprinted.
They were writing the software for their population while they were still largely an agrarian society waiting for the hardware to arrive.
Yes, and because they exercised that immense delayed gratification, a massive bottleneck was avoided. In other countries, foreign direct investment arrives. Companies want to build complex electronics, not just stitching cheap T-shirts, but actual high-tech assembly.
But they can't find the talent.
Right. They can't find enough workers who can read a basic technical manual or understand basic quality control math. The factories sit empty or the companies leave. In Vietnam, when the global tech giants arrived, the literate, numerate, highly trainable workforce was already waiting at the gates.
So by the late 90s and early 2000s, you have this increasingly educated, healthy population. But demographically, they're still largely spread out in rural villages, working small plots of land.
Right, the geography hadn't caught up to the education.
If the factories are being built in designated economic zones near the deep water ports, the people have to move. They have to physically relocate to where the capital is flowing.
Which triggers one of the most significant rapid demographic shifts in modern history,
Wow.
the urbanization wave.
The raw demographic data paints a picture of a society completely on the move. The rural population dropped from 84.7% in 1990 down to about 61% today.
That's millions of people.
Meanwhile, the urban population growth rate has held incredibly steady at between 2% and 4% annually for decades.
This raises an important question, though. 2 to 4% annual urban growth might sound like a minor statistic, but when you apply compound interest to a massive population base of tens of millions of people, the absolute numbers are staggering.
If you do the math on that, it represents a relentless, ongoing migration. Roughly 2% of the entire rural population packing up their lives and transferring to the cities every single year, year in and year out.
Unbelievable.
It is the logistical equivalent of taking the entire population of a small European country and moving them into newly built urban centers in Vietnam annually.
How does a developing nation handle that immense volume of urban influx without the cities collapsing under the weight?
That's the billion-dollar question.
We have seen countless examples in other regions, Latin America, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where hyper-urbanization without sufficient industrialization leads to massive, sprawling slums, crippling crime rates, and total infrastructure failure. The cities simply cannot absorb the bodies.
So how exactly did Vietnam avoid that fate? Because outside of some expected traffic and housing crunches, you don't see the catastrophic slumification that ruined other rapid growth models.
They avoided it by perfectly syncing their urbanization with what economists call the demographic dividend.
The demographic dividend.
Yes. This dividend occurs when the working age population is significantly larger than the non-working age dependents, meaning young children and the elderly.
Yeah, so lots of workers, few dependents.
Vietnam had a massive bulge of young, healthy, literate, working-age people arriving in these urban centers at the exact historical moment when foreign-owned factories were desperate for labor.
Perfect timing.
The cities didn't collapse into mass unemployment and crime because these migrants weren't idle. They were immediately absorbed into the formal economy. They were put to work building the very infrastructure, the very housing, and the very export goods the country needed to survive. The demand for labor rose at the exact same time the supply of labor arrived in the cities.
But this urbanization isn't just a story about millions of people changing their mailing address. It represents a fundamental rewiring of their relationship with money, labor, and time. This brings us to what the researchers call the modernization of the labor market, or, as the data frames it, the transition into the salaried era.
The salaried era. It is a phrase that sounds incredibly mundane to someone sitting in an office in London or New York, but in the context of a developing nation, it is a revolutionary economic phase.
The historical turning point in the labor data is incredibly sharp. Wage and salaried workers went from representing a mere 1.7% of total employment in the early days of the study to over 46% in recent years.
A total paradigm shift.
And correspondingly, what the World Bank strictly classifies as vulnerable employment, which usually means unpaid family workers or own account workers struggling in the informal, unregulated economy, plummeted.
Let's unpack the microeconomics and the deep psychology of this shift into the salaried era. Imagine the financial reality of moving from subsistence farming to formal employment.
It's got to be night and day.
When you are a subsistence farmer, your family's entire income is at the absolute mercy of the weather, pest infestations, and hyperlocal market fluctuations. If a flood wipes out your rice crop, your income goes to zero.
Zero, just gone.
You cannot plan. You cannot project your finances forward by even 6 months. You are in a constant state of high-risk survival.
Wait, we need to address the elephant in the room here. We always hear about the downsides of factory life in Southeast Asia, the 12-hour shifts, the strict management, the repetitive motion.
Yes, the sweatshop narrative.
Are we wearing rose-colored glasses here? Is moving off a family farm into a massive foreign-owned factory actually an upgrade, or are we just looking at a different, more industrialized flavor of exploitation? Is that a fair assessment of the sources?
It is a vital question, and we have to rely strictly on what the aggregate socioeconomic data is telling us, removing romanticized notions of both factory life and farm life.
So what does the data actually say?
The sources do not deny that industrial factory work is grueling, monotonous, and hard labor. However, the data narrative firmly points to an objective, measurable improvement in job quality and life stability compared to what existed before.
Okay, how so?
The reality of vulnerable employment in agriculture means that an injury or a bad harvest equates to literal starvation or crushing debt to local moneylenders. Transitioning to formal salaried employment provides a legally binding contract, predictable biweekly wages, and a baseline level of labor regulation.
So it's about the psychological shift from uncertainty to predictability?
Exactly. Predictable income changes the entire economic framework of a family unit. It allows families to systematically save money.
Because they know when the next check is coming.
Right. It allows a worker to approach a formal bank, demonstrate steady income, and take out a loan for a scooter to commute, or a refrigerator, or even a mortgage. It allows parents to confidently plan and pay for their children's continued education.
That long-term planning kicks in.
And from a macroeconomic perspective, when 46% of your country has a predictable paycheck, that population can consume predictably. A salaried class is the indispensable foundation of a modern domestic consumer economy.
And what does a newly salaried, increasingly urbanized population want to do with that predictable income? They want to get connected. They want to integrate into the modern world, which leads us to the data on the digital leapfrog.
The tech adoption numbers are just, wow.
Their technological infrastructure went from literal zero to globally competitive in the blink of an eye.
The term leapfrog is thrown around a lot in tech circles, but Vietnam's modernization is the textbook macroeconomic case study of how it actually works in practice to accelerate GDP.
The tech stats in the report are staggering. Mobile cellular subscriptions in Vietnam went from zero in 1990 to over 130 million today.
More phones than people?
Literally, there are physically more active cell phone subscriptions than there are people living in the country. And internet usage now reliably covers over 70% of the entire population.
And if you track the adoption rate of these technologies, it is not a slow, steady climb. It is an explosive exponential curve.
Right. If you map out their economic growth and you look at the tech adoption line right after the year 2010, that is where the true digital leapfrog occurs. The adoption rate just goes completely vertical.
Here is the underlying mechanism of why that leapfrog matters so much to the broader economy. When developed nations like the United States or the UK modernized their communications over the 20th century, they had to spend decades and billions of dollars laying physical copper wire across every single town and city to connect landline telephones.
So much physical infrastructure.
Developing nations like Vietnam looked at that incredibly slow, capital-intensive model and simply bypassed it entirely. They didn't have to lay the copper wire. They skipped straight to erecting cell towers, moving their population directly onto mobile networks and broadband internet.
They effectively saved decades of infrastructure lag and billions in obsolete capital investment.
Precisely. And this accelerated everything across all four quadrants we discussed earlier. Think about the friction of a pre-digital supply chain. If you were a coffee farmer in the Central Highlands in 1995, you have no idea what the global price of coffee is. You have to accept whatever the local middleman offers you.
You're just in the dark.
If you are managing a port, you are dealing with mountains of paper manifests, causing days of delays. But with mobile broadband, that farmer can check global commodity prices in real time on their phone and negotiate better margins.
It totally levels the playing field.
Supply chain logistics, customs clearance, and global shipping can be tracked instantaneously. Mobile networks allowed for digital banking to instantly reach rural areas that never had and never will have a physical brick-and-mortar bank branch.
So the tech isn't just a shiny object, it's actually making the whole economy faster.
This digital connectivity acted as a massive friction reducer, lubricating commerce and acting as a multiplier for all that manufacturing GDP growth discussed earlier.
But this modernization isn't just in their pockets with smartphones or in the ports with digital manifests. It's in their biology.
The human impact.
This brings us to the human impact of the wealth, which the sources frame as the health dividend, because ultimately, a quadrillion dong GDP is just a number on a central bank ledger if it doesn't translate into longer, healthier, more secure lives for the citizens actually generating that wealth.
And the data emphatically notes that it did translate. The biological impact of this economic boom is profound.
The life expectancy numbers are incredible. Life expectancy at birth rose from around 70 years in 1990 to over 75 years today.
5 whole years added.
But the most striking metric in the health section is child mortality. Under 5, child mortality plummeted from over 50 deaths per 1,000 live births down to about 20.
That specific drop in child mortality is the ultimate proof of long-term public health investment. When an economy grows by 4,700%, the primary fear among development economists is always capital flight.
The money just leaving the country.
That the wealth will just sit offshore in the corporate bank accounts of foreign investors or be hoarded by local elites. But these specific health statistics prove that the economic gains permeated the physical reality of the country.
They actually spent it on the people.
Tax revenues generated from that exploding manufacturing base were actually mobilized by the state. They were used to fund hospitals, to build clean sanitation and water treatment systems in rapidly expanding urban areas, and to vastly improve maternal and neonatal care networks.
For you listening, Think about how a society fundamentally alters its psychology when parents no longer carry the heavy statistical expectation of losing a child before their fifth birthday.
It changes everything.
Think about how the workforce mentality changes when the average worker suddenly realizes they have 5 extra years of healthy, productive life ahead of them. It changes the calculus of everything. If you expect your children to survive, you have fewer of them, and you invest exponentially more of your salaried income into each child's education.
It creates a multi-generational feedback loop of forward-looking optimism.
It does, but as you alluded to, whenever wealth is generated this fast, whenever a country transitions from extreme poverty to middle income status in a single generation, we have to interrogate the data on distribution. We have to ask the difficult questions about equity. Who is actually capturing the bulk of this newly minted wealth?
Which brings us to the critical balancing act: growth versus equity.
Because it's a macroeconomic tale as old as time, a country strikes it rich through industrialization or resources, and the top 1% buys fleets of yachts, while the bottom 99% stays trapped in expanding slums. To measure this, the researchers rely on the Gini index.
For context, the Gini index is the classic economic metric used to measure income inequality within a nation. A theoretical score of 0 means perfect equality. Every single person earns the exact same income.
Everyone has the same amount of money.
And a score of 100 means perfect inequality. One single person holds all the wealth, and everyone else has absolutely nothing.
According to the World Bank data on Vietnam, their Gini index has hovered remarkably, almost stubbornly stable, between 35 and 36 for years during this massive growth period.
Which is really unusual for this kind of growth.
Furthermore, the data breaks down wealth by quintiles, showing that the wealthiest 20% of the population holds about 43% to 44% of the total income.
We really need to contextualize how impressive that stability is. A Gini coefficient of 35 is certainly not a utopian society of perfect equality. But in the specific realm of hyper-rapid growth emerging economies, maintaining a score in the mid-30s is an absolute triumph of policy.
Why is that so hard to do?
In many developing nations that experience sudden, massive influxes of foreign capital and GDP growth, you see the Gini coefficient skyrocket into the 50s or 60s. A few well-connected oligarchs or monopoly owners capture all the newly generated wealth.
So the rich just run away with it all.
Right, while the sudden economic boom causes local real estate rents and food prices to inflate, meaning the working poor actually get poorer in real purchasing power.
So what does this all mean? How exactly did Vietnam avoid that oligarchic capture? How did they maintain relative social equity during an explosive 4,700% GDP per capita growth?
They achieved it primarily through the structural nature of their growth. Because they relied on broad-based manufacturing rather than just resource extraction, the wealth was distributed through that massive expansion of the salaried class we talked about earlier.
Ah, the predictability of the wages again.
When you move millions of people from $0 subsistence farming into formal wage-paying factory and service jobs, you aggressively raise the baseline floor of wealth for the masses.
So everyone goes up a little bit.
The rich certainly got richer. There are billionaires in Vietnam now. But the middle and lower classes saw their incomes rise at a proportional rate, keeping the overall inequality gap from widening out of control. It was the definition of shared prosperity through wage labor.
However, and this is a big however, there's a very dark side to this miracle, one that is becoming impossible to ignore in the report. We have to examine the severe price of development, specifically the immense environmental pressures.
You cannot build a $105 billion, heavily industrialized manufacturing sector for free. Nature always collects the invoice.
These numbers are genuinely alarming. According to the data, total greenhouse gas emissions in Vietnam have climbed from 124 million tons to over 450 million tons of CO2 equivalent.
That's a massive, massive surge.
And the report specifically calculates that the economic damage from these CO2 emissions, when measured as a percentage of their gross national income, is rising steadily. The environmental degradation is actually starting to eat into their financial gains.
It is the unavoidable, heavy environmental footprint that trails behind rapid economic growth.
If you map their economic growth against their carbon emissions over the last 30 years, the two lines move in terrifying lockstep. I mean, picture a scatter plot where the rising line of GDP is mirrored almost exactly by the rising line of greenhouse gases. I would just paint a warning red over this entire part of the data.
This is what development economists call the classic middle-income dilemma. to industrialize fast, to power thousands of high-tech assembly lines, to run the deep-water ports, and to light up the massive new megacities, you require cheap, incredibly reliable baseload energy.
You can't have the factories powering down randomly.
You cannot run a global supply chain on intermittent power. And for the past 30 years, for a developing nation, reliable baseload energy has meant burning fossil fuels, primarily relying on highly polluting coal-fired power plants.
So they basically had to choose between wealth and the environment.
Vietnam effectively traded environmental purity for economic survival and mass poverty reduction. It's worth noting that almost every single developed nation in the West did the exact same thing during their own industrial revolutions.
But the stakes for Vietnam are uniquely existential, aren't they? They aren't just contributing to a global problem, they're uniquely vulnerable to the immediate consequences of it.
Yes, they do not have the luxury of ignoring their emissions for another century while they get rich. Vietnam possesses massive, highly populated, extremely low-lying coastal areas.
Like Mekong Delta.
The most critical is the Mekong Delta in the south, which is the agricultural heartland of the entire country, the rice bowl that feeds the population. For Vietnam, climate change and rising sea levels aren't abstract, future-century environmental concerns. They are imminent physical threats to their sovereignty.
Because if the sea level rises.
If the oceans rise even moderately, the saltwater intrusion into the Mekong Delta will fundamentally destroy the soil's ability to grow rice, devastating their domestic food security and potentially displacing millions of citizens.
Which would just wreck the economy.
It would create an internal refugee crisis that could derail the entire system.
So they're effectively trapped in a brutal paradox. They need to keep the industrial economy growing at high speed to lift the rest of the country up to high income status. But the very method of that growth burning coal to power factories is actively threatening to drown their coastal cities and ruin their agriculture.
A race against time, really.
To pivot an economy of this massive scale away from dirty growth, to transition a quadrillion dong industrial machine to green energy without causing a recession requires immense, focused, and highly efficient regulatory power. Which brings us to the final piece of this complex macroeconomic puzzle, governance and institutional leverage.
You simply cannot manage a 21st century highly complex globalized economy using a 20th century agrarian bureaucracy. The institutions of the state have to evolve in tandem with GDP, or the whole system bottlenecks.
The report looks closely at the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI, to measure this evolution. The data shows that Vietnam's governance has experienced distinct fluctuations over the decades, but there is notable, undeniable upward mobility in two vital areas: regulatory quality and government effectiveness.
Both crucial for foreign investment.
Furthermore, there is a fascinating metric tracking the density of new business registrations, and that line has spiked dramatically in recent years. This proves that there is surging commercial vitality on the ground. Everyday citizens feel confident enough in the legal system to officially register and start formal businesses.
If you track the WGI data over time, say on a radar chart, you see the shape of Vietnam's governance capacity expanding outward. This expansion represents what economists refer to as the institutional reform dividend.
Wait, how does an institutional reform dividend actually play out for a business owner or a foreign investor?
It means the government recognized that it couldn't rigidly direct a modern economy from the top down. As the economy grew infinitely more complex, they continuously reformed their own legal and regulatory frameworks. They shifted from being a state that dictated every economic action to a state that facilitated private enterprise.
So getting out of the way, essentially.
For a foreign investor, improved regulatory quality means it takes fewer days to clear customs at the port. It means tax audits are less arbitrary. It means you can generally trust the local commercial courts to enforce the supply contract. They systematically cut the bureaucratic red tape where it mattered most to ensure the global supply chain kept flowing smoothly through their borders.
I understand the progress, but looking at the full WGI dataset, we have to acknowledge that it's not a flawless, perfectly modernized system yet. While effectiveness and regulatory quality are definitely trending up, the data shows there is still significant glaring room for improvement in other dimensions, particularly concerning anti-corruption measures and overall regulatory consistency across different provinces.
That is a completely accurate, necessary reading of the sources. The transition from a centrally planned system to a market economy is inherently messy and rife with friction. Corruption, bribery, and inconsistent local regulations act as severe drag coefficients on their growth engine.
Like a hidden tax.
They act as a hidden tax on every transaction. While the governance has improved enough to facilitate the current 4,700% miracle, the data clearly implies that to reach the next level, to break out of middle-income status and become a truly high-income developed nation, those remaining institutional and anti-corruption bottlenecks will have to be addressed with aggressive force.
So pulling all of these 13 interconnected threads together, from the initial $9 GDP through the factories, the massive investments in female education, the millions of smartphones, the rising emissions, and the evolving bureaucracy, it brings us to a definitive synthesis about this 30-year journey.
If we synthesize this entire deep dive, what we are really analyzing is the successful establishment of the Vietnam model. It has effectively become the definitive reference sample for how an emerging economy can successfully navigate the modern globalized era. And the data shows it works sequentially.
Let's break that successful sequence down one last time to really crystallize it.
Step 1. Recognize and immediately utilize the demographic dividend as your entry point. A massive young population is your raw material.
Right, the youth bulge.
Step 2. Preload education and basic healthcare to turn that raw population into high-value, highly capable human capital with a specific, intense focus on female labor participation.
Getting the minds ready before the factories arrive.
Step 3. Use hyper-aggressive trade liberalization to plug that human capital directly into the center of the global supply chain, making yourself an indispensable manufacturing hub. And finally, Step 4. Use the massive foreign wealth generated from that trade to drive permanent structural transformation, moving the entire society from low-yield, vulnerable agriculture to high-yield, formalized industry.
It sounds so impeccably logical when laid out sequentially like that, but maintaining the political will to execute it over 3 tumultuous decades is the real miracle. But we have to remember that past performance does not guarantee future results. The sources point out massive, looming macroeconomic risks on the horizon that could derail the next phase of their development.
The demographic dividend that supplied endless labor for their factories is beginning to fade. They are facing a rapidly aging population, meaning the ratio of workers to dependents will soon flip.
So the advantage they had is disappearing.
Their energy consumption intensity remains terrifyingly high, and as we discussed, their physical geography puts them at ground zero for the devastating impacts of climate change.
Vietnam has successfully completed what the report calls the accumulation from quantity to quality. They've built the immense foundation. But their future, their ability to keep growing, now entirely depends on whether they can make the next, much harder leap. Transitioning away from assembling other countries' designs and leaping into the green economy, domestic innovation, and high-tech automated manufacturing.
Which leaves us with a critical, perhaps uncomfortable macroeconomic question to ponder. Vietnam built its historical miracle by engineering itself to be the perfect, highly educated, highly efficient human engine for the global supply chain.
Right.
But we are now entering an era where artificial intelligence and advanced robotics are beginning to fundamentally dominate both manufacturing floors and complex services. In this new era, can the Vietnam model actually be replicated by any other developing nation today? Or was Vietnam the very last country to successfully climb this specific industrial ladder before technology fundamentally kicked it away?
A heavy, fascinating thought to chew on regarding the future of global development. Just remember that stark white page and the incredible multifaceted journey from $9 to a quadrillion-dong economic engine. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Vietnam National Development Research Report. We will catch you on the next one.